Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, The Grant Specialists. My name is Chinmay, and today I'm going to explain you the guidelines for clinical trials and cohort studies grants 2025. In this session, we will be looking at objectives and intended outcomes of the grant scheme, followed by some overview of the opportunity, what key documents and resources are available for the researchers, followed by some eligibility criteria, the key assessment criteria. After that, we'll be looking at some outcome snapshots over the past 5 years from 2020 onwards till 2025. We'll be looking at some application requirements followed by some checklists for applicants. Objectives and intended outcomes. The objectives of the clinical trials and core studies grant schemes are as follows. The first objective is to support high quality clinical trials and cohort studies that addresses important knowledge gaps which lead to implementable findings for human health. The second objective is to fund any size of research which contributes to building reliable evidence on human-related, health-related interventions and risk factors. Now let's look at some intended outcomes. The outcomes for clinical trials are to generate reliable evidence on the effect of health-related interventions on behavioral and health outcomes, while for cohort studies, the intended outcome is to generate robust data on associations between risk factors, exposures, and health outcomes through prospective or retrospective designs. All right, a bit of overview of the opportunity here. So we are looking at the NHMRC Clinical Trials and Cohort Studies 2025, which is referred to as CTCS in this presentation. Some key dates there. So it's already open in Sapphire. The applications are now open in Sapphire on the 10th of September. The minimum data deadline was due on the 8th of October, which means if you haven't submitted your application before the minimum data deadline, you won't be able to any longer submit a new application, as NHMRC does not allow new applications to be initiated on Sapphire after the minimum data deadline. Now, the scheme close date is the 5th of November 2025, so it's 5th of the next month. So I think you should be prepared with the application and looking for some compliance checking on the applications before submission. The project duration, the allowable duration for projects for this grant opportunity is anywhere between 1 to 5 years. As we look at the objectives of the grant, they'll be funding any size of a clinical trial, any size of a cohort studies. So what NHMRC is asking for any projects that range from 1 to 5 years. If your project is successful, the expected start date for your project will be the 1st of October 2026, unless if it's successful and you submit a deferred commencement variation, that might be extended by up to 12 months, but that's up to you once it's successful. The funding available for this grant opportunity across both clinical trials and cohort studies is $75 million for the life of the project. Now, one thing to note here is the NHMRC's policy on use of generative AI in grant writing. These days, it's very tempting to use generative AI to write some sections of the grant, as it gives you some starting point to begin writing a proposal or any other sections. However, NHMRC has strict policies on using generative AI, so we would strongly recommend on having a look at that. One thing that the policy suggests is the CIA, or the chief investigator of the grant, has to be very careful when using generative AI, because once you put in some data on there, it's impossible to retrieve that data because it goes to other servers across the globe. Also, if it's found that some information is entered into the grant proposal which is incorrect because AI gave you the incorrect information, so the chief investigator would be held responsible for that and not the NHMRC. Some key documents and resources. I think for this grant opportunity, the key documents are available on Grant Connect. I have put in some links here for Grant Connect. The documents available there are grant guidelines, which you can click the link and download. Some peer review guidelines. So peer review guidelines are something that NHMRC gives peer reviewers before they start peer reviewing your applications for this fund scheme. So it would be good to have a quick look at those guidelines because that explains the peer review process, the duration, and what sort of information the peer reviewers will be looking at in your application. So it would be worth having a look at those. Grant guidelines are something that's released by NHMRC to the applicant. So there are very specific rules, and which is what I'm going to explain you in this session as well. So, I mean, hang in there. Grant proposal template. Grant proposal template is a specific template that NHMRC has for every application that they receive under this fund scheme. They would There are strict eligibility and strict compliance requirements on the grant proposal on being using the template. So be very careful to use that template and not alter that template in any shape or form. Then we have NHMRC's website. So there's an NHMRC clinical trials and cohort studies website to refer to that gives information on objectives, intended outcomes, and some key dates as well. It also gives some information on the previous year's outcome snapshots. So it would be worth having a look at that website. Also, we have peer-reviewed resources on the NHMRC's website too. So it would be worth having a look at those too. Application portal. NHMRC uses application portal called Sapphire to accept applications. So I would strongly recommend all the chief investigators on your project should request access to Sapphire as soon as possible. NHMRC does not encourage any access requests until 72 hours before submission. So let's say your submission is on Wednesday, which is the case for all NHMRC grant rounds, which is a Wednesday. So if a CI hasn't requested an account by Monday or Friday the last week, they won't be able to be a CI on your application because they won't have an NHMRC account. So that 72-hour deadline is very critical. So I would strongly recommend having all CIs request an account ASAP. We'll look at these details further in terms of application and profile requirements for each CIs on Sapphire. But as I said, make sure that everybody has an account and everybody has accepted your request on Sapphire to participate in the grant. Some eligibility requirements. Eligibility requirements for this grant is twofold. One is a project team eligibility versus the multiple grants held or applied for eligibility. First, we'll start with the project team eligibility, which is CIs and AIs. The total number of allowable CIs for this opportunity are 10. So 10 CIs and 10 AIs are allowed. In terms of the CIA, they must be an Australian citizen, New Zealand citizen, permanent resident, or have a valid work visa over the duration of the grant, and they must be based in Australia for more than or greater than or equal to 80% of the funding period. So if you're a CIA, let's say, and you have a valid work visa to Australia, and you're planning to move to Australia and you're going to spend more than 80% of the time here, well, you can certainly apply for this grant. As I said, up to 10 CIs and 10 AIs are allowed per application. Now we'll look at some multiple applications and grants held eligibility. There's no limit on the number of applications a CI can make to this grant opportunity. So CIs can make 1, 2, 3 applications with different teams to this grant opportunity. Also, the eligibility or the number of applications that they make for this grant opportunity is not impacted by any other grants that they currently hold. However, one thing to note is if they have another NHMRC grant, across all NHMRC grants, you can claim 1 FTE of salary. So let's say if they're claiming a salary from a partnership project, which is at about zero point 0.8 FTE, and they are successful in the clinical trials and cohort studies grant as well, since the funder is the same across both the schemes, they will be paid 1 FTE of salary. So 0.8 from partnership projects and 0.2 from CTCS, or 0.6 from partnerships and 0.4 from CTCS. It depends on what the CIA is looking for. Key changes since the last round. There's a section 8.1.2 that's explanation of fundable applications that NHMRC has included in the guidelines as well. So that they speak about what they're looking for in an application to make it fundable. There's a new section, section 13, that's been introduced on fraud and corruption in the guidelines as well. Now, this consumer and community representative CCRs will be reviewing your application from this round onwards. NHMRC has developed a CC consumer and community involvement toolkit which is hyperlinked in the text there, which you can have a look at. It's very critical to have consumers and community representatives in your application. In this round onwards, we have 20% of the assessment criteria separately dedicated to consumer and community involvement. So this has become a really important topic of interest. So I would strongly recommend having a look at the toolkit and also look at addressing this criteria really well. This leaves us with the scientific assessment criteria of only 80%, while 20% is for consumers and community representatives. Also, Cure for Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has partnered with NHMRC for this round for accepting applications for funding that focuses only on cystic fibrosis. So, when you're writing an application in Sapphire under Funding Partners section, if you believe your application meets this criteria or resolving issues for cystic fibrosis, and you're willing to claim some funding from Cure for Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, please do select yes as funding partners there, which will enable NHMRC to give your application to Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Cure for. Now let's look at some assessment criteria. Now there are two types of assessment criteria as we discussed. One is the scientific assessment criteria, which is 80%, and one is the consumer and community involvement assessment criteria, which is another 20%, which adds up to 100%. So under the scientific assessment criteria, we do have significance that constitutes to 30%. Research quality is about 30% as well, and team quality and capability is 20%. In the consumer and community involvement criteria, there are three sub-criteria which add up to a total of 20%. However, they're equally weighted across those 20%. So the criteria under community and consumer involvement are consumer and community involvement activities, support for consumer and community involvement, and relevance for consumers and community. So what we'll do is, in the following slides, we'll look into what each of these criteria constitute and what each of these criteria are expecting you to write in your application. Let's look at some significance to start with. Significance is defined as an extent to which the findings will advance knowledge. So whatever, how far would your research findings will advance knowledge in your field of research? Are the relevant Is the research relevant to the objectives and desired outcomes of the grant opportunity? That is something that you should be addressing. Is the rationale behind your research supported by evidence? Has the CIA or the research team conducted strategic, systematic literature review? Would the research have significance and sustainable impact uh, in the health space or on humans? So I think those are the questions that you should be thinking of when addressing significance as the assessment criteria. So this criteria aligns with section A of your grant proposal. So section A of your grant proposal, you must address this criteria. Let's move on to research quality, which constitutes to another 30%. It encompasses the quality and feasibility of the proposed research. Is there a clear research question there? Have the risk associated with your research, or have the risks been identified? And if they have been identified, are there strategies mentioned there to mitigate those risks? Does the proposal include realistic timelines, of performance indicators, time frames, and how are you going to monitor the progress of your projects? Are there some strategies being discussed here? These are the questions, or these are the things that the reviewers will be looking at in this section under this research quality assessment criteria. Or this aligns with sections C, D, E, and F of your grant proposal. So please make sure that this is a significant part of your grant proposal. So please focus more on addressing this criteria. Then the remaining 20% is the team quality and capability. What the reviewers will be looking at here is, does the CI team have appropriate mix of skills and experience to achieve the outcomes and objectives of the project that they have been proposing for? Does the CI team have a high track record in the past 10 years? Have they shown some experience with engaging consumers and consumer representatives in research? Are the track records up to date? Have they got good track record? So these are the things that they'll be looking at when they're assessing team quality and capability. This relates to sections G and H of your grant proposal. So if you look at it that way, you know, every section of the grant proposal is clearly articulated to us to address different assessment criteria that are mentioned in the grant guidelines for each opportunity. So it will be very important to go through the grant proposal template first, as well as the assessment criteria, and then try to marry them up together. Let's look at the consumer and community involvement assessment criteria, which constitutes 20%. The first one, which is consumer and community involvement activities. So what the reviewers are looking here is the proposed research developed with an ongoing consumer or community involvement? Are consumers integrated into all aspects of the project? Is there an evidence of ongoing community involvement during the research? And how are the findings going to be disseminated or communicated with the consumers and community participants? So these are the things that they'll be looking at. So this constitutes to about, if you look at these three criteria distributed across 20%, you can say about 6.66% for each criteria. So be very sure that you address this criteria very clearly. Also, the other one is support for consumers. So, are the governance arrangements in place to support consumers? Are there any details of timelines, or resources required for the genuine sort of participation in the project? It shouldn't be tokenistic. So when you're actually bringing in consumers, we strongly recommend that you to have them involved from the get-go, from the project planning stage, rather than just a tokenistic mention of them being there. Does the also what reviewers are looking here is, does the applicant team have previous experience working with consumers, involved in and providing them support along the duration of the project? Right. So, and the third one we're looking at is relevance for consumers. So, are the objectives of the grant opportunity met in a way that are understandable for consumers and community involvement? Are there people from different cultural, ethnic, or linguistic backgrounds in the community pool that you're trying to involve? Also, uh, will this be addressing the health policy or making some changes in the health policy, improving the health service delivery or health policy that will lead to better health outcomes for individuals? Is your project trying to address that? That is what they'll be looking at as well. And all these three sub assessment criteria constitute align with section B of your grant proposal. You have 3 pages to address these three criteria. So we strongly recommend you go 1 page per criteria when addressing this. Clearly articulate what involvement you're going to have with consumers, how you're trying to incorporate consumers or get them on board from the get-go, rather than giving them a tokenistic mention, and specifically focus on governance requirements as well as dissemination of outcomes, because that is something that where consumers are not really involved in most of the projects. So please focus on that. All right, in terms of the assessment process, how it will work is the peer reviewers will independently undertake assessment of your applications against the assessment criteria, which we just saw. The scientific assessment criteria as well as the community and consumer involvement assessment criteria. You might want to have a look at section 6 and page 8 of the peer review guidelines. As I had mentioned earlier, the peer review guidelines are really critical, so I would strongly recommend you have a read of those guidelines, as they give you assessment process and assessment timeframes as well. So what they'll do is the overall scores of the shortlisted applicants will be used to produce a ranked order list of applications on which funding recommendations will base. So what they'll do is that they'll score an application and rank it. Once they have ranked the applications with an overall score of 4.5 and above, and a minimum score or minimum mean score of 4 across each assessment criteria will be deemed fundable, subject to availability of funds. So, I mean, if let's say a scenario occurs where your application meets the 4.5 and the 4 criteria there, however, the pool of money has ended, which means although it was fundable, they won't be able to fund you because there's no money left in the pool. All right, let's look at some outcomes over the past 5 years for the clinical trials and cohort studies scheme. Let's start with success rates. So for NHMRC, if you look at on the x-axis there, it says 2020 CTCS, 2021 CTCS, and so on. So what we are referring to there is it's 2020 clinical trials and cohort studies grant for funding in 2021. So 2021 CTCS for funding in 2022. 2022 CTCS for funding in 2023, 2023 for funding in 2024, and 2024 for funding in 2025. This year's round is 2025 CTCS for funding in 2026. So, if you look at the percentage success rates, it the trend looks to be increasing initially, but then from 2023 CTCS onwards, it's a declining trend. For 2020 CTCS, 6.9% of the total applications that NHMRC received. 2021 it was 11.3, 2022 was 11.6, where the trend went up, but then it started coming down, which is 11.1% in 2023 and followed by an 8.8% in 2024 CTCS. Now, if you look at the number of total funded applications for each year and applications funded across clinical trials and cohort studies. So for 2020 CTCS, the total funded applications were 30 applications, out of which 20 were clinical trials and 10 were cohort studies, right? Which means there were twice as much cohort study applications funded by NHMRC compared to the cohort studies applications. So there are twice as much as clinical trials applications than cohort studies applications for CTCS 2020. For 2021 CTCS, the trend remains the same. So the number of clinical trials funded were twice as much as the cohort studies funded. However, for 2022 CTCS, the difference reduces. So 16 clinical trials were funded. However, 12 cohort studies were funded as well. So more cohort studies were funded compared to clinical trials. So the difference was 4. Then in 2023 CTCS, the difference slightly increased again. It was almost twice clinical trials were funded compared to cohort studies. But in 2024 CTCS, if you see again that the difference reduced, so more cohort studies were funded, right? Now we'll look at the area of research NHMRC has funded. So in 2020 CTCS, they had 0 applications for basic sciences. Clinical medicine and sciences, they had 17 applications funded. They had 2 applications funded for health services research, and public health was 11. So if you look at the trend, so health services research, initially the trend increased, starting from 2 applications in 2020 CTCS to 6 applications in 2021 CTCS. However, it dropped back to 2 applications in 2022, 1 applications in 2023, and 0 applications last year. However, if you look at that, primarily the area of research which NHMRC is funding for this fund scheme is clinical medicine and sciences and public health. So, if you're planning to submit an application in basic sciences or health services research, we would recommend not to do so, because there's a varying trend of funding, a varying trend of awards across these 2 basic research criteria, these 2 broad research areas, we must say. So if you come across an application under this sort of basic broad research area, you can recommend the researchers to either not apply or change their broad research areas and align their project with the other research area. The dominant sort of research area that they are funding is clinical medicine and sciences and also public health. So, so for research officers, if you see something like this, please take this to your note. All right, let's look at some application requirements. The 2 major application requirements, one is minimum data, which the deadline, as we said, has passed on the 8th of October. So before 8th of October, if you have had your minimum data compliant, which means you will be able to submit applications for this funding round. If you hadn't had your minimum data compliant before the 8th of October, I would like to bring this to your attention that you would not be able to submit your application for this application round. Then we had primarily, the other one is grant proposal. So grant proposal, there are 8 sections to the grant proposal. The first section is background, significance, and impact. That's 2 pages. The NHMRC has given you 2 pages to actually address the significance assessment criteria in this section. Then we had, as we discussed, section B aligns with consumer and community involvement. We have 3 pages there to address that criteria. So I would strongly recommend using one page across three sub-criteria, which will make it 3 pages. Sections C, D, E, and F align with the research quality assessment criteria. It totals to 9 pages of your grant proposal. So please make sure these criteria are clearly addressed across these 9 pages. Sections G and section H are based on the team quality, which constitutes to 20% of your assessment criteria. So we have 2 pages per CI for capability and achievement, and 1 page for the team quality and capability as such. So I would strongly recommend address that assessment criteria in these 2 sections. I've also hyperlinked the link to the grant proposal. So when you click these links or the links up in the resources section, it will lead you to Grant Connect, where if you do not have an account yet, you will need to create an account to download the Grant Connect documents and other resources from Grant Connect. So if you click the link here as well, it will take you to Grant Connect and ask you to create an account first and download the documents. All right. The other application requirements are top 10 publications. So NHMRC requires you as a researcher to nominate top 10 publications of yours from the past 10 years. This is a requirement for all CIs. So what happens is you must include publications in the past 10 years from the close date. If you have any career disruptions, you can actually extend the duration by the duration of your career disruption preceding the past 10 years. So every publication will need you to include an explanation in an explanation section. In the explanation section, we strongly recommend you to start with your role into that publication, how that publication aligns with your research, and also how does it impact. What impact does it have on your application when you include it? One important thing to note here: do not use impact factor or any journal matrices in your publication. You can use FWCI, field weighted citation index, but do not go something like impact factor of 2.7 or Q1 journal or Q2 journal and so on and so forth. I recommend not for you to not include that in there. In the citation box, you can include DOIs there. That's fine, but that's primarily to put in your citation as a whole. Do not add more information except the DOI in that box. Another thing to note in the explanation section, please do not add more citations in the explanation section. That explanation section is for you to clearly justify your role in that publication and the impact of the publication overall to research and your application. So let's stick to that. So funding partners, as I discussed previously, Cure for Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has partnered with NHMRC for this round. So if your application is focusing on cystic fibrosis, please select yes under the funding partner section. Third party research facility. So this is something you tick yes when you're actually using a third party to do some services for you, and then you're paying the money to them for those services, for using their services. So if you're using a third party research facilities, you would need to keep in mind 2 things. One is get a quote from them or letter of support from them that you will need to upload to your application. Second, whatever costs is associated with that third party research facility, those costs need to be claimed under the other research cost section of the budget in your application. We'll be looking at it in the next slide. Budget development. So there are 3 components to the budget development in the Sapphire portal. One will be your salary, one will be your other research cost, and the third will be your equipment. Let's start with salary. So every salary every salary entry will ask you to describe the position function. What salary level are you applying for? So it is classified as PSPs, which is personal support packages. One thing to keep in mind: if you're having a PhD student who will be working on the project, you must be claiming their salary at PSP3 at 50%. PSP4 and PSP5 are usually used for experienced researchers. If you're a CI and you're claiming salary for a CI, it must be at PSP5. Other research costs. One thing before we move on is justification for salary or reason for salary. This is a very important section of why you're claiming the person's salary, what FTE you will be claiming it at, where the person will be based. This is important because NHMRC gets a clear understanding of what's happening in research and where the money is going to go to. Also, internally, in terms of project management, on the contract perspective, that really helps a lot when the multi-institution agreements are being negotiated with other organizations. So I strongly recommend filling that section with at most detail as possible. Let's look at some other research costs. Other research costs are all the costs that are involved that are associated with your research project, which are except the salary and the equipment, right? So it can be so when you're putting in the other research costs, you describe the name of the cost item, then you have how much in dollar value, how much dollars are you claiming for every year, and that adds up to a total depending on the length of your project. And there's a justification box there as well. Please put in as much detail as possible, and please be succinct because all these text boxes have a character limit. Equipment. Equipment is a very interesting item in a budget. So an equipment must be more than 10,000 and less than $80,000. So when I say that, a single piece of equipment must be more than 10,000 and less than $80,000. If you are claiming anything under the equipment, NHMRC will need a code for that. That need not be uploaded on your application. You might hand it over to your research office or your organization, and if an HMRC comes back and asks them questions, they will be able to provide it to them on your behalf. So, for example, if there's an equipment entry where you're buying iPhones, you're buying computers, you're buying for your research, individual item is less than $10,000. However, the total invoice value will be is between 10,000 and $80,000. You still cannot claim it under equipment. It has to go under the other research cost section because if you remember, as I said, individual item has to be more than $10,000 and less than $80,000. A bit of checklist for applicants. So before creating an application, so the moment you decide, okay, I want to apply for this funding opportunity, please contact the REO of your organization, inform them that you're planning to apply for one, and ask them if they have access to the previous successful applications for this funding opportunity. Right? Please do that because that is critical for the success of your project. That gives you some resource to refer back to an understanding of how other people have written their applications and address criteria. I mean, the criteria could have changed over the past 5 years, but overall, it's the same thing. Uh, Complete your Sapphire profiles, ensure all the CRs have all the Sapphire profiles up to date, and send invitations to all CRs and get them to accept on time. During the application, make sure that you complete the minimum data requirements, check the eligibility requirements, complete all parts of your application, complete your profile, identify, the relative to opportunity and career disruptions that you're going to claim in the application. Make sure all fields are completed and attachments are uploaded. Before submitting an application, you will be getting some feedback from your respective research offices. Please try to incorporate that feedback for all images and people. Please de-identify them in your application. Check all the things are correct. Certify an application to RAO before the deadline and let RAO submit your application on your behalf. A bit of contact list there. So if you need some clarification on the guidelines, I mean, you can email directly to help@nhmrc.gov.au or give them a call on 1-800-500-983. If you have any questions if regarding glitches or in with Sapphire, those are the same contact details there. If you have any questions on your eligibility of a particular application, RAO in your organization is the best person to contact to. RAO is the Research Administrative Office or the Grants Office or whatever you might call it in your local organization. But please do contact them because those are your go-to points for this. If you want some advice on writing an application, there might be peers in your area of research or your supervisor that you might be contacting. Also, there are local area specialists that might advise you with funding. And again, the RAOs in your institution might also be able to help you with your compliance check. So when they're doing the compliance check, they might be able to provide you some grantsmanship advice. One thing to note, NHMRC will not be responding to any queries after 1 p.m. on the day of submission, which is the 5th of November for this grant opportunity. If you have any questions, please comment down below. And thank you for listening to my to this session. And if you have liked it, please do like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to share it with your friends and your research community.